Today I'm talking with Father John Deere to talk about nonviolence and peace as a ground for social action. He is an internationally known voice for peace and nonviolence, a popular speaker, peacemaker, organizer, lecturer, retreat leader, and author of over 38 books. I just got an updated number on that. He has organized and participated in nonviolent campaigns for over 3 decades. He's been arrested some 75 times, and he spent over a year in jail for peace. He recently launched the Beatitudes Center for the Nonviolent Jesus, which offers online Zoom workshops, classes, retreats, gospel nonviolence. I'll give you the link for that at the end of the interview here. And his latest book is Praise Be to Peace, Psalms of Peace and Nonviolence in a Time of War and Climate Change. So welcome, Father John.
Thanks for having me, Reverend Sarah.
Yeah. So let's jump right in. I've got probably 5 hours worth of questions for John today. We're gonna try to see how many of them we get to. But let's just start with, how do you define nonviolence, and what is its purpose?
That's such a great question for me, because as I've traveled the country over 40 years now, that's where I always say in my talks that we all need to define nonviolence. We all have to start figuring this out. To me, it's the hope of the planet. It's the hope of the churches, the country, the world, and it's the key to the spiritual life, and to the hope of any theology or ecclesiology. And so for me, the greatest people in modern history are Gandhi, Dr. King, and Dorothy Day. And that's all they talked about. I mean, Gandhi and Dr. King used the word nonviolence morning, noon, and night. They never really, I don't use the word love, and I don't use the word peace, because they don't mean that much in America anymore. Nobody uses the word nonviolence but Gandhi and Dr. King, and that's why I stick with this. So what does it mean? So here's my clumsy, I've been redefining it every year for 40 years. I mean, it's a tactic and a spirituality and a strategy for social change. It's a spiritual path toward a future of peace and the God of peace. It's a way of life. It's a political methodology for positive social change that always works. It's all of these things. If Martin Luther King were here, he'd say, no, John doesn't understand it at all. He would define nonviolence as power, which is very interesting. He would say, we all think we're powerless. There's nothing we can do. He gets this from the Gospel of Luke. We have power, and that is active, creative nonviolence. So to unpack it a little more, I would say it's active love, pursuing the truth of our common unity, that we're all one. Every human being is a sister and brother of every other human being. We're all sons and daughters of the God of love and peace. And the deeper you go into the truth of of reality, our common unity, the more and more it's so overwhelming. The gift of peace was already given. And the deeper you go, the more you widen it to include, Sarah, the creatures, and Mother Earth and the universe. And it's spectacular. We're talking universal love. And you could never hurt anyone or anything ever again, much less kill someone or sit back quietly while there's 30 wars, 15,000 nuclear weapons, 4 billion people in poverty, extreme poverty, killings going on all the time, and the destruction of the earth through catastrophic climate change. So there's nothing passive about nonviolence. You see how I'm still trying to define it. It's active love that pursues the truth of our common unity, giving our entire lives to persistently reconcile with every human being and all the creatures and Mother Earth through non-killing, through active love, standing up publicly and resisting every structure and system of injustice and violence that hurts and kills others, our sisters and brothers. Allowing the God of peace to disarm our hearts of the roots of violence and war in us, that we could be instruments of her disarming love in the world. Practicing from this day forward till the day we die, unconditional, non-retaliatory, all-encompassing, all-embracing, universal love.
Oh, I'm in. I'm
With
in,
one
John.
catch, Sarah.
What's the
This is
catch,
the
John?
doozy. This is the catch. Can you hear me? Are you
I can
sitting
hear
down?
you. Yeah, is everyone sitting down? Here's the catch.
This is serious. This is where everybody leaves me. There is no cause ever again for which you or I will ever again support the taking of a single human life or any life. We do not kill people. We do not kill people who kill people to show that killing people is wrong. And we do not sit back when people are being killed. We give our lives to stop killing. And so really, my friend Daniel Berrigan said, what we're talking about here is death and the metaphors of death, means of death. It's like St. Paul speaks about the principalities and powers. It's way beyond any one person. It's the global systems of violence. And this is a way of life and a methodology and a spirituality that says no to all that and is actively working to transform it to the power of suffering love. The one thing that Gandhi and King would talk about that I've almost stopped talking about because Americans can't hear it, because we're so, especially comfortable white Americans. It requires the willingness to accept suffering in the struggle for justice without a trace of the inner desire to retaliate with further violence. We are going to disarm everyone. As Dr. King said, in the end, we will even win everyone over through our suffering love to the truth of our common unity. And that's the logic of the cross. And that's where I think nonviolence is. I can give you one more definition, but I think I've used up half the time.
No, I think that's a good ground of, yeah, I think that's a great introduction. And there's, in the tension that you introduced at the beginning of your definition, and then you said King would say, and this idea of power.
Yeah.
Right. There's something that's sitting with me right now with what's going on in the world around us, with, seeing a lot of graphics of raised fists, right? And what does the raised fist mean? And what is the relationship between the advocacy and fighting and rising up and nonviolence? And that gets a little sticky for me. So, with what you're seeing right now, what is that relationship between rising up and nonviolence?
Well, they're the same. If you understand everything within the hermeneutic of Kingian, Gandhian nonviolence, what Dr. King is trying to teach us is that we have a way to transform this very sick culture if we dare use it. We have a powerful methodology of confronting violence, ending violence, and transforming the culture of violence into a culture of nonviolence. But it's scary. It means we take risks without using weapons, without using the means of our opponents, of those who have violent power. But our power, the power of nonviolence, is much more powerful. Now, what Dr. King is saying is that the only way positive social change happens in human history is bottom-up, people power, grassroots movements of nonviolence. And I'm convinced, from Jesus to, the abolitionists, the suffragists, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, then the beginnings of the women's movement, the environmental movement, and now there's thousands of movements. That's how nonviolent positive change happens, through grassroots organizing, and that's the power. And but the more nonviolent it is, the more transformative it can be. Violence doesn't work. Violence as a movement doesn't work, and violence in the world doesn't work. It's just leading us to the brink of destruction. But nonviolence can work and actually bring a new nonviolent society. And we know that with the evidence of Dr. Erica Chenoweth now. This great scholar we've never had before. The last 10 years, her research has changed everything. She's considered one of the greatest intellectuals on the planet, and she's just now at Harvard. But she's proved this with statistics. So I love the Black Lives Matters movement. I think it's been a huge redemptive force in our country. Erica says that over 26 million people participated in it this summer, the largest movement in US history, and it was meticulously nonviolent. Now, if Martin Luther King was still alive, he'd say, everybody has to be trained if you want to march in the streets with me. You have to do a 3-hour training. Every movement up until the last week of his life, he required trainings. And that's what we should be doing if we were smart. But the peace movement is so poor. There are great groups trying to do this, but everybody needs to go through a workshop and actually train in it, because we're all experts at violence. But we, especially church people, we have to learn how to be nonviolent in every aspect.
I think that's a really key point.
I
think that's where the confusion comes for people about the term or about how to do it is where do I learn such a thing? Because we don't learn nonviolence.
Right, and that's the failure in every situation, in every aspect of this culture of violence, but it's also the failure of the churches. Number one, there are great groups doing trainings. My old group does them, paceibene.org or campaignonviolence.org, and we have good books that you can use yourself to guide yourself in them. But if you're going to go take to the streets, all the more you got to be doing your inner work, be really, really nonviolent, because if someone's going to come up and yell at you or attack you, it could trigger your old wounds and you're just going to respond violently. That's no good. You have to be doing your inner work. You have to be practicing nonviolence in your personal life. You have to train, and then you got to get in the streets. What we need are meticulous, quiet, peaceful, nonviolent actions where everyone's trained, where millions of people are in the streets at all time for democracy, for the end of racism and poverty, for the end of the death penalty and gun violence, for the end of war, permanent warfare, and the end of nuclear weapons, and the end of the destruction of the earth. We got our work cut out.
We got a lot of walking to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you brought up churches, and I was saying earlier I was raised in churches as well, and so there's something I've been dying to ask you, as someone who has worked through the lens of Jesus, right, and through gospel nonviolence, that when I was raised, there was often a binary characterization of there was this angry God of the Torah and there was this loving God of the New Testament. And luckily, I made it to seminary and I got that sorted out and figured out there's a loving God in both. But there is kind of this hang-on of that can appear within some Christian conversations about this difference of the angry God and the loving God. Can you talk about whether that shows up for you when you're working with people, or what your response to that might be?
It's such a powerful question. Thank you. And I haven't studied it as much as you. I'm not as smart as you on this question. So, of course, it comes up. And, well, here's where I'm at with it. I'll just come right out with you, with it. First of all, I'm a Christian. I'm a follower of Jesus. Gandhi said Jesus is the most active person of nonviolence in the history of the world. That's been a huge revelation for me. And I decided he's right. And then poor Gandhi said, and the only people on the whole planet who don't know that Jesus is nonviolent are Christians. It's pretty funny and pretty tragic. So if Jesus is violent, who cares about him? He said, I don't need him. I don't want to have anything to do with him. That's not helpful. If Gandhi's right, now we're getting somewhere. Now, did you know, Sarah, that Gandhi read from the Sermon on the Mount every morning and every evening for the last 45 years of his life? I went to India where he meditated. I went with his grandson. per month. And that still haunts me. Is why I've started the Beatitudes Center for Nonviolent Jesus, to try to keep teaching the nonviolence of Jesus. And Gandhi just stayed with, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. That's the commandment. You have heard it said, love your countrymen and hate your enemy, which is the nation state politics. But I say to you, agape your enemies, unconditional nonviolent love to the people being targeted by your nation state. Then you will be sons and daughters of the God of universal love, who lets the sun rise on the good and the bad, and the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. Here in the most political sentence in the entire Bible, love your enemies, which is the end of the nation-state system. It's way beyond the end of war. It's the most explicit description of the nature of the mystery of God. I think in the whole Bible, God is a God of universal love. God is nonviolent. So I think Jesus is teaching what he learned throughout the Hebrew scriptures. It's clearly there, a God who's slow to anger and full of compassion and mercy. We read that in the Psalms. In Isaiah, a God where there's no more death in all my holy mountain, where even the animals are mixed with the children. They're all nonviolent. It just kills me. I love that. But Jesus goes farther in his language in this talk of, universal love and peacemaking, and really infinite compassion is right there as well. And he says the very first of the 6 antitheses is, you have heard it said, thou shalt not kill. I say, don't even get angry. Go and reconcile. The commandment in the Greek is katagalite. Be reconciled with those who have something against you, the people you've hurt. Go and be reconciled, then worship me. So I think, and Gandhi wrote a lot about this because he's the only one who studied the Sermon on the Mount. He decided when he was younger, well, Jesus wasn't an angry person. And so I have to conserve my anger. If you want to practice nonviolence, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus clearly says, avoid these 2 emotions, anger and fear. And he clearly advocates 2 other emotions, grief and joy. In the Beatitudes, they're right there. And we don't do any of that. We've got an opposite as Americans. Gandhi did that very intentionally. My friend Archbishop Tutu does as well. Tutu should be a raging, angry lunatic, my point. But he's not, and he's changing the world. But he personally told me, he wept on my shoulder and said, I've cried every day of my life because of the world, and I've laughed every day of my life. And I said to myself, oh yeah, that's right, he lives the Sermon on the Mount, like Gandhi. I never met anybody like that, except for Daniel Berrigan. Mother Teresa was totally nuts. She was so much fun. The great people don't have time to be angry. Now, I'm saying all this because Jesus said God is like that. God is not violent, not a God of war, not a God of injustice, not a God who can't wait to throw us into hell, not a bitter, angry God, a God of universal love who's wildly crazy of us going, I love you so much. And nobody wants to be with this God. We much prefer a God of violence who's like us. We've created a false God in our own violent image. It's funny because we are all trying to play God, and God wants to be human. To be human is to be nonviolent. I don't know if that's helpful or gets at your question.
I think that's really helpful. Because what I'm hearing you say, and not trying to put words in your mouth, but what I'm hearing you say is that we can see it in the Psalms. We can see pieces of this. And then Jesus comes and gives it a framework and puts it together in this beautiful Beatitudes. And that's what we're talking about as this reference for nonviolence. So it's not that it isn't anywhere ever. It's that it's coming more into the world through this framework. Would that be fair?
Well, Yes, I would say the Beatitude, the whole Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and his life.
Yeah.
Jesus models perfect total nonviolence, and that's what the disciples are supposed to practice. And he sends them on a mission. I always joke, Jesus thinks he's Gandhi or Dr. King marching into Burma. Jesus marches to, that was pretty funny. Yeah. And Jesus marches to Jerusalem. He does civil disobedience, and he's killed. Gandhi wrote a lot about the execution of Jesus, how Jesus goes into even deeper nonviolence. I think even the resurrection is spectacular nonviolence. It's amazing. There's no
that's an interesting, that's an interesting.
No vengeance, no grudges, no go and kill Pilate for me. And these people abandon him, and he makes breakfast for them. If you think about it, it's very amazing.
Yeah.
And that's what Christianity is supposed to be about. Like when I don't think St. Paul measures up at all to the standards of nonviolence in the four Gospels. In fact, when I think about it, Paul never read the Sermon on the Mount. If you think about it.
We could go on this for hours.
He was killed before that, and Paul was probably a mass murderer. So I don't buy Paul. And then before you know it, the Christians throughout the Sermon on the Mount for 1,700 years, we've had this blasphemous just war theory until Francis. He's the first one trying to work on this change. So we have our work cut out, but Gandhi's, and I'll end with this, Gandhi said a powerful thing. This question about God, he said the image of God is critically important for the transformation of the world, because he said, if you can begin to imagine that God is pure nonviolence, to unpack love and peace and compassion, totally nonviolent, there's no violence in God, then we would begin to worship a God of peace and nonviolence, which is not what we're doing now. Worship. And once you begin to worship a God of peace and nonviolence, Gandhi said, then we begin to become people of peace and nonviolence. Isn't that lovely teaching?
I love that. I can buy that. All right, so I'm going to take that. I'm going to take that into the last area I want to ask you about, because I have a 30-year-old well-worn copy of something you wrote called Christianity and Vegetarianism. And it is folded over and highlighted. And also your book, They Will Inherit the Earth, Peace and Nonviolence in a Time of Climate Change was really important read for me. So, we have more and more data about the problems of our food system, right? The problems of all of the things that we're doing to the earth, the loss of biodiversity, the problems with PTSD for people that we have working in slaughterhouses who are asked to carry out these things, right? And yet many people who are concerned about climate change or feel that they are compassionate to others have a really hard time changing their diet or giving up leather shoes or not taking their kids to the zoo or buying down comforters or whatever it is, right? Why do you think that we have such a hard time making choices like that?
Because we've utterly failed to live up to the gospel message of nonviolence, to take Dr. King and Gandhi seriously as teachers of nonviolence. We have to start all over. Every seminary, school, church in the country and the world has to teach nonviolence. But things are so bad now, we're on the brink of destroying the planet, that we all have to rise to the kind of total holistic nonviolence modeled by Gandhi, Dorothy Day, and Dr. King, not to mention Jesus. So in my book, The Nonviolent Life, I say to be nonviolent, you have to really start, and we have to teach this to practicing nonviolence to yourself. No more beating ourselves up, no more putting ourselves down. We have to cultivate interior peace and nonviolence. Secondly, practice meticulous nonviolence in all our relationships and toward all people on the planet, and really try to figure out how to be nonviolent to people who push our buttons. You have to be part of the movements of social change. Now, We've never talked about that. We're just so violent. We have been ingrained in violence. You could hurt children. Men can beat up women. White people can be racist. Sure, you can bomb and kill whoever you want. Yeah, you can vaporize hundreds of thousands of people. And of course, animals are just to be slaughtered. They don't mean anything. And Mother Earth, who cares about it? You can destroy it, and the oceans, and so forth and so on. And that centuries of destructive violence have now led us to the brink of nuclear war. We've never been in such a serious moment, and to catastrophic climate change. But you're right to mention about the treatment of animals and the creatures, not only because we're moving on 6 million species becoming extinct just in these years. It boggles the mind, and infinite war is to come. But it just shows how immature we are, how blind we are, and how not serious we are about our discipleship to Jesus. We all have to step up and start making real changes in our lives. Now, the thing about, I've said this on the book tour for They Will Inherit the Earth. I'd be going, hey, you're all environmentalists. Everybody cheer. Yeah, of course. And you love Jesus and you're going to work for Mother Earth. Yeah. Oh, so you're all going to be vegetarians or vegan.
Crickets.
No,
yeah.
The United Nations has said, that the methane from the cows, which are grown and slaughtered for your hamburgers at McDonald's, are the leading cause of carbon in the atmosphere. It's fossil fuels, but also our diet. So we don't want to be any more, certainly eating any red meat. We all have to become vegetarians and change our life. That is a basic minimum. I say that as soon as I got into this when I was 21, I became a vegetarian. I'm 61 now, 40 years ago. And Gandhi, that was the first step. But Gandhi said, you can measure a society's nonviolence by the way it treats its animals. So we could talk a lot about it. I could talk a lot about, the earth too, what we're doing to the earth. And religious people and seminarians and church people in training, especially, you've got to get back in touch with earth. If I were running a seminary, I'd make people spend one day a week out in the country or on the ocean, walking and being in touch with the earth. Because Jesus said, as I wrote in that book, blessed are the meek, the people of nonviolence, they will inherit the earth. Well, we've rejected nonviolence, so we're violent people, and we've not inherited the earth. We're destroying the earth. You and I want to make that connection again that Jesus made. Wasn't he a genius to say that? So I don't know if that gets at your answer. I'm a little.
It does. No, it really does, John. And thank you so much for your time and for all of these thoughts. And for those folks who want to go deeper into this, John's new website, which is Beatitudes, plural, center.org, has information about retreats and classes. And there's a New Year's Day retreat I think I'm going to try to get my booty over to there. Also, he has a peace podcast and those 38 plus books at johndeere.org. So if you want to learn more about living a nonviolent life, if you want to learn more about what Christianity and Jesus and the Beatitudes has to do with advocacy and living a nonviolent life, I can think of no better place to start than with John's books. So thank you so much for your time.